Well, good evening and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. As many of you know, much of our history-related programming is anniversary-driven. For the past few years, we've been engaged in a great Civil War sesquicentennial series with the extraordinary faculty from the Military History Department at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. This year, we're also examining, on an occasional basis, the 75th anniversaries of some of the seminal events that took place in 1939. 4 years ago, we looked at the 50th anniversary of the Nixon-Kennedy debates, and starting in August, we'll be marking the centennial of the outbreak of the First World War with a series of talks called Great War Wednesdays, which we're doing in conjunction with the National World War I Museum at Liberty Memorial. But tonight, we're really revving up the Wayback Machine. Tonight, for the first time ever, we're going to take a look at something that took place precisely 700 years ago today, which is to say, June 24th, 1314. The denouement of the Battle of Bannockburn. It was a smashing victory by an outnumbered Scottish army over an English force, and ever since then, it's been considered a landmark moment in Scotland's quest to be independent. It's a quest that, for some at least, continues to this day. Indeed, in less than 3 months from now, the people of Scotland will vote in a referendum on whether they should secede from the United Kingdom and form an independent country. To give us a handle on how and why this history still resonates, it is truly my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, a person listed in your program as Tony Mullis, a longtime friend since our graduate school classes at the University of Kansas. Of course, in those days, he went by the name of Randy Mullis. His real name is, in fact, Tony. Randy is his middle name. But for most of his life, he preferred to be called Randy. That is, until he joined the U.S. Air Force and was posted to Great Britain. In British English, as you may know, I guess you do, Randy is not so much a name as an adjective. It has to do with certain proclivities. You can look it up. So that's when he decided to start using his actual first name. Since that time, he answers to both Randy and Tony. In fact, you can even carbon date when his friends entered his life by which name they use for him. Whichever name you choose to call him, you should know that Dr. Mullis is a professor of military history at the Command and General Staff College. His primary field is American history, but when I asked our great partners at Fort Leavenworth if there was anyone who could talk about the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn, Randy was the first to volunteer, for which I am extremely grateful. But there's something to be said for old school ties. Lads and lassies, please welcome Tony Randy Mullis.
Well, thanks, Henry, as always, for a vibrant introduction. So tonight, of course, ask a first question. How many of you are of some Scottish descent? Color me surprised that you guys would show up for this tonight, so I'm glad you made it. How many of Irish or Welsh descent? Oh, excellent. Now for the real question, how many of English? Oh, good. I'm glad you guys came out too. Okay. So we're an equal opportunity here tonight, and I think we covered just about everybody. in some shape or form. Actually, when I did research on my name, it actually is English. There's a village called Mullis, just east of London. But tonight we'll all be Scottish and see what happens. So, and we'll have some questions dealing with the future of Scotland. So my rudimentary qualifications is I did serve 3 years in Scotland at a place called RAF Edsall, which is now closed. And I did sleep at a Holiday Inn Express once upon a time. So given those qualifications and my colleague Terry Beckenbaugh, who actually took a field in English history, I was able to get through this. So we'll see what happens tonight. But we will look at the battle itself and then segue into the issues that characterize the independence debate today. 18 September is the target date for the vote, and we'll get to that as we go along. For those of you, and I'm guessing with this crowd, everybody knows where Scotland is, okay, and England and the various counties and whatnot. So some of these areas I'll refer to tonight, but I think we have a very knowledgeable crowd, so I'm not going to worry too much about your geography. But context, like everything, is always important. The guy in the upper right, you probably recognize, I almost hesitate to ask, how many have seen Braveheart? Oh, joy, okay. Well, we'll do our best. Hold on to that memory, but things didn't exactly happen the way as they were portrayed in that. But King Edward, I think, he's not exactly the nicest guy on the planet, okay? But when you look at his accomplishments as a monarch, he's hard to beat, okay? You may not like his tactics, but he did get what he sought out to do. Okay, his son, on the other hand, Edward II, not as successful, has some issues, and we'll get into those as we go along. But when you look at England and Scotland in the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th centuries, or 13th and 14th centuries, all is not well either in Scotland or in England. Both have internal conflicts that we'll talk about, and of course both tend to dislike each other for various and sundry reasons. But you also find a lot of English lords having lands in Scotland, a lot of Scottish lords having lands in England, so the aristocracy has their own little worldview. Okay, and Scottish nationalism as we know it today isn't the same thing. There probably is an identity, probably some Gaelic connections that go along with that, but that connects to the Irish as well as the Welsh as well. Within England, the English magnates, the large landowners, are very powerful. Two of the more powerful ones are the Earl of Lancaster and the Earl of Warwick. They will basically opt out of Edward II's campaign to go subjugate the country in 1314. That becomes important later in our story. Others, like the Earl of Gloucester and the Earl of Hereford, and I love Hereford House, but I don't think it's the same thing, basically will go with him, but they do not accomplish what he needs to be done, that is for Edward II in Scotland. So the focus of the internal struggle is, should Scotland be subjected to English rule under Edward I and then subsequently Edward II? Should Scotland be an independent kingdom under its own monarch? Okay, and we'll get to that here shortly. But don't forget about France. The French always have a role to play when it comes to England and even with Scotland. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. Now to Scottish politics, which were equally as messy as English politics in many ways. And the whole event really is triggered by the accidental death, at least I'm pretty sure it was an accidental death, of King Alexander III. When he dies in 1286, he has one living direct heir. She is his granddaughter, the Maid of Norway, and her name is Margaret. Margaret, unfortunately, lives in Norway, and when she makes the trek over through the Orkneys, she dies. Okay. So when your direct successor dies, what happens in medieval times? You have a war, right? Or you have a fight or something. So there's a controversy over who will succeed King Alexander to the throne. And of course, there are many claimants that come to bear. And the one that wins out is this gentleman, John Balliol. And he is competing with a guy named Robert the Bruce. Now, not the Robert the Bruce that you know from Braveheart, unless you remember the old guy that is Robert the Bruce's grandfather, but he is Robert the Competitor, and he has a claim to the throne as well. So these two will not literally, but figuratively battle it out. But in the process of trying to select a successor, the guardians of Scotland ask King Edward to help them resolve the problem. So Edward gets involved. He's more than happy to help solve Scotland's problems. Okay, and you can know how the rest of the story goes, undoubtedly. So he selects John Balliol to be king, and as long as he's compliant, as long as he is a puppet of King Edward I, he can remain monarch. But by 1296, when Edward I asks John Balliol to supply troops for war against France, and Balliol refuses, he's had enough. So he will basically dethrone John Balliol, creating another secession crisis, turning it back over to the Guardians, but for all intents and purposes, Edward I is monarch of Scotland as much as he is of England at that point. Well, things begin to change slightly in 1297. There are some folk, some of which you've probably heard of, a guy named William Wallace. Yes, okay, we all know William Wallace, okay, in the Battle of Stirling Bridge. And William Wallace, along with Andy Murray, of course, well, not this Andy Murray, but if you look at British History Day, any tennis fans out there will recognize Andy. He won his match yesterday, and he is trying to defend. He's the first Brit to win in some time. And I found it interesting when I looked him up this morning, he lists himself as British, not as Scottish, even though he's born in Glasgow. Okay, I'm not sure which side he's come on now, but I'm sure he's focused on other matters at the moment. So basically, Wallace and Murray become guardians up until really about 1298, the following year, when, if you remember from the movie, things didn't go so well for William Wallace at a little place called Falkirk, okay, or Falkirk, where the Scottish army is basically decimated. That doesn't stop the resistance in Scotland against Edward I, but Edward basically consolidates his power. There are a few other get-togethers between then, but Wallace is on the run. He's an outlaw, as are other types as well. But of note is Robert the Bruce, not the grandfather, but the grandson, the Robert the Bruce that will be the hero of Bannockburn. And Robert, like all cognizant Scotsman at the time, has a tendency to switch sides depending on which way the political winds are blowing. When it's convenient to be subservient to Edward I, let's be subservient to Edward. When it's better for me to be loyal to Scotland, we're going to switch to Scotland. So there's some question about exactly what Robert the Bruce was after. Is he out for Scottish nationalism, for Scottish independence, or is he really out just for the throne? It makes a great soap opera. I'm sure someday somebody will make a movie out of this. Oh, okay, maybe they have already. Okay. Nonetheless, well, you only got to the good part at the end, but we'll figure that out later. So, make a long story short, the Bruce has a competitor, a guy named John Comyn. And Comyn and Bruce meet in Dumfries at Greyfriars Kirk. Kirk in Scottish is a church. No one knows exactly what they were doing, what they discussed, but to make a long story short, Bruce kills Comyn, leaving him not the only claimant to the throne, but a clear-cut favorite to take over the throne, which he does, which ultimately results in the crowning of Robert the Bruce as King of Scotland in 1307. So or rather 1306. So he takes control. Now he has to legitimize his rule because he hasn't been blessed by the normal blessing processes. Now, some of the bishops in Scotland, and remember at this point, both Scotland and England are loyal members of the Roman Catholic community. Okay, the Reformation hasn't happened yet, so keep that in mind, that you got Catholic on Catholic violence at this particular point. Well, Edward is none too happy with the revolt after 1296. There's a couple of battles at Berwick and Dunbar, and he does something that the Scots have never forgiven him for. Of course, he did a lot of things the Scots haven't forgiven him for, but he took the Stone of Scone, the Stone of Destiny, okay, which is very, almost holy to many Scotsmen, stuck it in his coronation chair, and until relatively recently, it has stayed there, okay? So a symbol of Scottish subjugation by Edward I in a very real sense. Again, Falkirk, we've already mentioned, that's where he doesn't annihilate the Scottish resistance, but puts a big dent in it. By 1305, he's able to capture, not personally, but through some chicanery, a guy named William Wallace, who's hauled off to London, and you've seen the movie, so you kind of know what happens after that. So Wallace, in many ways, become a martyr for the cause of Scotland, and the local headlines, of course, captured what was going on at the time. And to this day, I think they've run this headline for 700 years, so, okay. But what sets us up for the Battle of Bannockburn? Okay, basically what I look at very quickly is the strategy, looking at time, space, and resources. If you have a financial strategy, if you have a family strategy or military strategy, these are the basic aspects that you have to deal with. One of the neat things from Robert the Bruce's standpoint is he knows there's a deadline. He knows if Edward II is going to try to defeat him, he has to go to Stirling Castle by the 24th of June. Well, what happened, or what explains the 24th of June, is the fact that the constable of Stirling Castle, a guy named Philip Mowbray, has made an arrangement with Edward the Bruce, one of Robert's brothers, saying, you guys are laying siege to us, we'll make a deal, which was fairly common at the time, that if we're not relieved by the 24th of June, ergo today, okay, 700 years ago, we will surrender the castle to you. So the expectation on Mowbray's part was that the king or some representative would send an army in, they would relieve us, we would hold on to Stirling Castle. More on that as we go along. But Edward was absolutely convinced that the way to subjugate Scotland was to defeat, as his father had done at Falkirk, the Scottish army. So let's take an army into Scotland. I will seek battle, I will destroy the Scottish army, I will subjugate the Scottish people, and I will use my strength against their weakness. Okay, and his army is going to be more powerful, more numerous, more capable than anything Robert the Bruce can put together in Scotland. The Bruce, on the other hand, has to think differently. Instead of seeking battle, he chooses to avoid battle. It's a traditional strategy of the strong against the weak. Okay, when you're strong, it's nice to have a conventional battle. When you're weak, not so much. So he will opt for what I call down here at the bottom, skulking tactics or guerrilla warfare. Ambushes, hit and runs, those sorts of tactics that have been very successful for weaker powers against the strong. He will fight a war of attrition to break down the English will, which is not very breakable, mind you, okay, particularly if you're the king of England. He will resort to something I call, or has been called, castle warfare. Now, when you're weak, taking a castle is not exactly the easiest thing in the world to do, okay? They don't call these things castles for nothing, okay? They're very solid, they're very difficult to take down, but Bruce and his followers will be very successful in taking them out, or at least certain ones that lead to the Battle of Bannockburn. Again, quick geographic fix here. The key areas, the key castles we're going to be talking about are Roxborough, Edinburgh, and Stirling. Okay, nice in a row there. But these are key militarily, but also strategically and symbolically. This is where the strength of the English presence in Scotland resides. Why June? Well, as I explained earlier, it's because of the arrangement between Edward the Bruce and Philip Mowbray. Now, initially, Robert the Bruce was very upset, saying, oh, why did you do that? You know, now the English will know where we are, they can come beat us, and I'm trying to avoid battle. So it's the opposite of what he expects to happen, but in reality, it turns out quite well for Robert the Bruce, but Edward II and his tactics will have a lot to do with that. Now, Edward does bring with him a formidable force. He will outnumber the Scots at least 2 to 1, if not more. Okay? He will have heavy cavalry with destriers, and I guess Lou DeMarco was here and explaining everything about horses, so if you have any horse questions, email Lou, okay? But these destriers, which today are kind of medium-sized horses, were the big and bad horse of the era. The Scottish don't have these, okay? They have what they call palfreys, which are wee horses in Scottish, if you will, that can't compete. Infantry, Edward puts out a call for up to 25,000 troops, but realistically, about 50% show up. So guesstimates are anywhere from 7,000 to about 12,000. I know that's a wide scope. Foot soldiers will show up, but the combination of foot and cavalry should do the trick, except if you look back to Falkirk, the real difference maker was English archers, longbowmen. He will have them at Bannockburn, but he will not use them nearly as effectively or successfully as his father did at Falkirk. So hold on to that thought as we go along. The Bruce, on the other hand, cannot raise nearly as many soldiers as Edward can. Guesses are anywhere from 4,500 to 6,000, and 3 organizations known as Skilthrons. Okay, and we'll talk more about those as we go along, but he's able to muster 500 light cavalry. They can't match up one-on-one with the heavy cav of the English, but they can serve a very important role, which they will do during the battle itself. Okay, so here's what Edward plans to do with his heavy cavalry and his infantry. He will mass the heavy cavalry. He will know, or he knows, that the Scots will use the Skiltron as their basic defensive mechanism. And once we break the Skiltron, all cohesion, all coherency is lost, and the Scots will break, will exploit them, declare victory, and Scotland is ours. Not a bad plan, okay? Except he continually used to forget, what do I do with the archers? Yes, I have some, but they'll show up and do what they're supposed to do, hopefully at the right time. The other advantage he has is Philip Mowbray in Stirling Castle. Okay, in the castle, perhaps he can come to his aid because there are 100 or so Englishmen in the castle as well. Bruce, on the other hand, has a difficult situation. He traditionally is on the defensive, he traditionally doesn't want to fight battle, but he's also opportunistic. He will get indications that now is the time for all good Scotsmen to rise up to free their country and also legitimize my claim to the throne. Okay, you can put the two together, at least he can in his own mind. So he will make some tremendously difficult decisions as the battle begins and as it unfolds on the 23rd and 24th of June. Some say it was just a calculated risk, but it was also a gamble. Had Robert the Bruce lost on 24 June 1314, we may not be having this independence referendum as we know it today. Okay, who knows for sure, but that was one of the possibilities. So anyway, the battle will unfold and both will use their normal tactics, although the Bruce will pull some surprises on Edward II. The first thing he does, though, is he systematically takes out the symbols of English authority. He sends Sir Thomas Randolph to Edinburgh to take out Edinburgh Castle. He sends James Douglas, known as Black Douglas, okay, to Roxburgh, which this represents, to take it out. And through surprise, through siege, sliding, which means destroying the bulk of the castle, he effectively denies the symbolic value of these castles to the English, irritating Edward II even more. Okay. He also understands that the key to defeating these guys is to disrupt their food and water supply. Okay, it does rain a lot in Scotland, for those that have been there, but if you can take out the food, or the victuals as they would call them, to the castle, you're halfway to doing it. But usually there was a relief column, as Philip Mowbray will expect, to come save you from a siege, because sieges take a long, long time, except in the ones at Edinburgh and Roxburgh Castle. So once these are out of the way, all that is left is Stirling Castle. And if you've ever been by or near Stirling Castle, it's a pretty formidable location. How in the world do you take this thing? And siege seemed to be the logical answer. I show you this graphic not because it tells you everything you need to know about Bannockburn, because it doesn't. It's actually fairly inaccurate, okay? It has the 20th of June, okay? And this is not exactly how the troops lined up in their formations. Just to show you that this is not the easiest thing to figure out what happened to this day. And I think the BBC just produced a very good documentary on uncovering Bannockburn, what really happened there. When you take out the archaeologists and all the science and technology we have today, we're still trying to figure out exactly what happened at the battle. But here's the lowdown, or the quick and dirty, basically on what happened. One of the possibilities, or one of the concerns for the Scots, and the Scots are in blue here, as they should be, Stirling Castle is behind you. You've got the English host, or the English army, coming up the old Roman road and the road to Falkirk, which are these two roads here. Okay, so the English basically outnumber you, they outgun you, and they almost virtually surround you. Now what Edward is most concerned about is the Scots will run away, because they've been known to do that on occasion, and perhaps justifiably so. So I can't kill an army if it won't stay. So how do I get them to stay? Okay. Robert the Bruce, on the other hand, is saying, gosh, you know, there's a lot of Englishmen over there with those big bad horses and stuff. I don't know if we want to fight now, or what do we do? But politically, it was very difficult for Robert the Bruce to opt out of not fighting, if that makes sense. In other words, it made great political sense, it made great strategic sense to stay and fight the English on the 23rd and 24th of June. Well, basically, as the English army makes its way from Falkirk into Stirling, or the Bannockburn area, as the armies are falling out along the Roman road, making some reconnaissance up toward the Scots positions, one of the more eager knights in the English army, Sir Henry de Bohun, decides, gosh, that looks like Robert the Bruce over there. I'm going to take him out single-handedly, just like we do at all the tournaments with the jousting and all that sort of stuff. So he lowers his lance, Why he took a lance, I don't know, but he lowers it and makes a charge right at Robert the Bruce on his big destrier, okay? Bruce is on this little horse, this palfrey as they say, and that's basically the traditional description of what happened, that with his mighty battle axe, as he missed with his lance, Robert the Bruce came down swiftly and basically decapitated Sir Henry de Bohun. Both sides saw this. The Scots were elated, the English a bit depressed that things should start off so badly so early in the battle. Okay. None was more depressed than, of course, Henry, but that's another story. Okay. Meanwhile, as Sir Henry de Bohun was decapitated, Sir Robert Clifford and Mr. de Beaumont make a flanking maneuver to try to basically outflank the Scots and put them in a difficult position so that they could overwhelm them again with their numbers and win a decisive victory. Well, unfortunately for these guys, they have a similar problem. They don't have the individual combat, but the schiltron of the Scots will come down, basically engage the cavalry and stop them in their tracks. They're unable to break through this particular organization. So at the end of the day one, and it's really the afternoon that this takes place, but if you've been in Scotland in the summer, the days last forever, okay? The sun will not go down till about 11 o'clock at night, and it's back up around 2:30, so very short during this time. But the Scots won the first day. They had killed de Bohun, they had stopped the flanking maneuver, and now what to do for the second day, okay? The schiltrons turn out to be the secret weapon of the Scots. Since Robert the Bruce knew where the English were going, since he knew when they were supposed to be there, he could get his army there and practice and train his army for all sorts of contingencies. Okay, how do we use the schiltron not only defensively, but also as an offensive weapon? Which is not the easiest thing in the world to do, but if you have time, if you have highly motivated troops, which the Scots were, you can pull this off. Okay, so this is just a summary of what happened on day one. Again, you have Henry de Bohun going up, getting schwacked, and you have Clifford going over, trying to flank, and the Earl of Moray, basically with his schiltron, stops the English that evening. And as short as the darkness was, Edward says, well, now what do? I don't want the Scots to run away, so we got to keep them here somehow. So I'm going to move my entire army across the Bannockburn, which is, Bannock is a biscuit and a burn is a creek. Okay, I'm going to move them here, but when you look at this terrain, it's not ideal for the types of forces that Edward has. He's relying on heavy cavalry. This is something known as the cars. The cars basically is marshy, icky, sticky, slippery stuff. Okay, if you've been to Scotland, you know what I'm talking about. Not ideal for horsemen, particularly heavy horsemen. Okay, and notice that he's kind of constrained. If he sticks his whole army in here, he's kind of putting himself in a corner. A liquid corner, because you've got the Firth of Forth, the river, behind you, you've got the Bannockburn, and you're in mushy land, and you have the dry land up here going into the woods, but how do you get there is going to be problematic for Edward II. Now, if Dad were here, Edward I, I'm guessing he probably would have done something a little bit differently. Anyway, on the morning of the 24th, the key day of the battle, the Scots, as I'm sure the English did, have Mass. Okay, the abbot comes out, he blesses the Scottish troops, but what's interesting from here is Edward, allegedly, is watching the Scots as they kneel down before the abbot to receive their blessing. And he assumes, gosh, they must know I'm here, they must be kneeling to ask my mercy. Okay. Well, he has, Ingram de Umbreville is a Scotsman, but he's still loyal to Edward. And he says, I don't think so, boss. I think they're asking for mercy, all right, but not from you, okay? And none will flee for fear of death, okay? It's attack and die, okay, is basically what the Scots are planning to do. They're all in. They are committed to winning this thing one way or the other. And Edward says, well, let it be it, because, hey, I outnumber these guys. We always beat the Scots, except for that Stirling Bridge incident. We're going to do it again today. But as you know how the story turns out, basically it did not happen. Now, part of the problem here is the archers are in the wrong place on this graphic. So if you visually move them over, okay, they're going to be on the right flank of the English. But as the English heavy cavalry form up in this marsh carsland, okay, the infantry is behind them. They are trapped by the Bannockburn. So there's no maneuver room. They that's not a word, they squeezed the entire army into this limited space. Now, Robert the Bruce on the other end says, hey, we've practiced this before. We can actually move our skiltrons to take on the English army. So he actually begins to move his forces down, and they're up on a hill, down toward the English. The English move out upward toward the Scots position, assuming that the English will win from their perspective. Now, this is a close-up of a skiltron. Basically, a skiltron is a bunch of guys with 14-foot lances that are very sharp. Horses instinctively do not like to run into these things, okay? So that's a problematic, and as the English knights come up initially, remember they're in the front of the formation, well, I can't do anything, I'm just going to throw stuff at them, okay? Doesn't do a heck of a lot of good, because normally, if you remember earlier, this is where the archers come in. If they had launched a barrage or two or three, it would have weakened the skiltron, allowing the cavalry to break through, and once a skiltron breaks, it's no longer a good fighting organization. Another way to look at the skiltron from an English perspective is the mighty hedgehog. But since we're an American audience, I thought this example was even better, the mighty porcupine, okay? So if you think of a porcupine ever so slowly moving toward you, what's your instinct tell you? Run away, okay? But if you have nowhere to run, that could be problematic. So you've got all these spears coming at you, and if you're in the infantry and the horses or the cavalry start backing up, hey, this is not how this is supposed to work. We're supposed to be going this way, okay? And when you look behind you, oh, there's this big gully back there full of water. Yeah, I'm stuck, okay? And that contributes to the demise of the English. Again, to make a fairly long story short, although it's a fairly short battle, all said and done, as the skiltrons push, the archers do come out. They do begin to have an impact, but they're not only killing Scotsmen, they're also injuring and killing Englishmen as well, because they're not properly deployed as they should have been. And this is where the light cavalry becomes advantageous, because they're quick. They run in and basically disrupt the English and Welsh archers that are there. They disperse, sending panic back into the infantry, who then begin to panic and begin to try to flee for their lives. Especially when Edward's banner begins to disappear from the battlefield. Yeah, I think the gig is up and everything breaks apart. So there's nothing worse than chaos. Now, had Robert the Bruce had his own cavalry, or a larger cavalry, and perhaps more disciplined persons, perhaps they could have defeated the English even more soundly. But as it is, the English do make their way out of Scotland, not to be seen at least for a couple more years. Okay, you have one main group go toward Dunbar, which is where King Edward will go, and another group, the Earl of Pembroke, the Earl of Hereford, will make their way toward Carlisle. Hereford is ultimately captured, which for the Scots is a great deal, because captured earls are worth a lot of money, okay? Or in Robert's case, I can get my wife back and my kids, because they've been held hostage for 6-7 years now, from 1306, 1307. So as they make their way, they go to Carlisle Castle, which is an English stronghold, of course, in northern England, and James Douglas seeks to get Edward II, which would have been the real prize. That didn't happen. The king makes it to Dunbar. He sails to safety to fight another day. But he has problems back in England he'll have to deal with. So why did the Scots win, or perhaps why did the English lose? Okay, the terrain. Poor terrain analysis by the English. Now, the Scots had a distinct advantage of being at the right place at the right time and kind of controlling and shaping that environment, okay? And I think Robert the Bruce gets kudos for doing a good job there. The archers, we've already mentioned that, the limited use or the inappropriate use of the archers by the English. Using heavy cavalry conceptually made sense, but without the coordination with the archers, it wasn't going to work as it had at Falkirk. So another shortfall for the English. Leadership. Edward II had some very capable and very experienced commanders. Unfortunately, there was no, what we would call today, unity of command. Gloucester and Hereford were given joint command. Nothing like having two bosses, right? Okay, and deciding how do we go about doing business. And there are some internal issues that go with that. So leadership was a very difficult problem. Plus you lose Clifford and Gloucester in the battle. Something I don't want to get into, but there were other internal issues Edward II had with a guy named Piers Gaveston. Okay, for those of you that know your English history, fill in the blank. And the skiltron ultimately held. Okay, as long as the skiltrons held and used in a way they'd never been used before, it was very difficult for Edward to respond. Plus, the timing of the battle was such that it didn't last very long. So the shorter the battle, the more beneficial to the Scots. Okay, and one might argue, and you've seen Braveheart, that Scottish spirit will lead them to victory. And I think there is something to the morale and to the enthusiasm that the Scots displayed once they realized, hey, the day is ours. Okay, and of course that leads us to now the so what. So what's the outcome? Was it decisive? Kind of. It was decisive in the sense that Robert the Bruised had a more definitive, legitimate claim to the throne. Okay, but there's a lot of things it did not do. It did not guarantee Scottish independence. There would be more battles. There would be more disagreement. Okay, they will continue on with Edward III and just any other monarch that you want to mention after that. Roughly to about 1603, and for those of you who know your English-Scottish history, King James VI of the Stuart family becomes King James I of England, and that kind of puts a kibosh on issues for a short period. Okay, and it did not reduce English military power. In an ironic twist, it actually helped the English get better. They actually said, what did we do wrong there and what can we do better next time? And they learned maybe knights should fight dismounted. And when you get into some battles with the French later on, they will do that and quite successfully. And the internal struggles in England never ended. If you remember King John and the Magna Carta, there's still issues, how much power should the king have and how much should Parliament have? That goes on into the reign of Edward II, as well as his son, Edward III. How many are familiar with the Declaration of Arbroath? Excellent. So we got our true Scots over here. The Declaration of Arbroath, which I'd never heard of until I lived in Scotland and actually went to Arbroath, is quite a phenomenal document, but the part most people remember is this one, which is a very emotional appeal to Scots today. Okay, that as long as there are 100 of us who are alive, we will not submit to English rule. I'm paraphrasing here. And of course, this becomes a very powerful, emotive message during the build-up to the referendum on independence. And very quickly, King James showed up in 1603, but it's not until 1707, with the Act of Union, that Scotland and England officially become the United Kingdom. Okay, and one of the interesting stories I have when I lived in Scotland, this is in the early 90s. I came back from London, basically, got off in Montrose, which is a nice little town in Scotland. I was driving to Edsall, which is where I was posted, took a taxi, and I made the horrible mistake of asking the taxi driver what he thought about the recent general election. For the next 30 minutes, he proceeded to tell me, okay? And he started in 1707, okay? This is when those darn English got us Scotsmen drunk and lured us into this union, okay? He was very much a Scottish nationalist, and of course he has his perspective of things as well. So that was my first taste of the Act of Union and Scottish nationalism to a certain degree, but essentially it abolished the pre-existing Scottish Parliament, which of course is an issue today. You were represented, so it's not like the Scots aren't represented in Parliament, but you had to pay English taxes. We did that once upon a time too, I think. But you got to keep your own legal system, churches, and universities, which the Scots are rightfully proud of. Okay. Well, there were people that resisted this from the central authority in London to Holyrood or Edinburgh. Okay, so the Scots vote for it. By 1999, they established their own parliament. So you have a Scottish parliament that still exists today. You have members of the Scottish parliament as well as members of parliament from Scotland down in London at Westminster. In 2007, of course, Scotland and England celebrated, commemorated, pick a word, 300 years of union. I don't think there was a big to-do over this, either in England or Scotland, other than maybe some nice-looking currency that came out of the deal. Okay. And, well, you got to have Mr. Scott, right? Alex Salmond, who is the leader, the First Minister of Scotland, leader of the Scottish National Party, basically gives a lot of attribution to Braveheart is regenerating Scottish nationalism. Now, there's more to it than that, okay, than just Braveheart, but it's certainly, if you ever watch Rob Roy, which I actually kind of like better, but anyway, I'll leave that at that. So Scotsmen are kind of motivated, and independence is a very emotional issue, okay, as we'll talk about here very shortly. Basically led to devolution, but it's a double-edged claymore or a double-edged sword, okay, that Mr. Scott is holding here. Are the Scots pragmatically, realistically looking at independence from a practical standpoint, or is it purely a blood and soil issue that we fought and died against the English tyrant and it's our right to have our own country, or some combination thereof? And that basically borders what's going on with the issues. One thing I didn't know before I started researching this is that the Scottish independence referendum can have immediate reverberations in Europe, in Spain, in Catalonia. They're very closely watching what's going on in Scotland because, hey, we might like this independence thing too. The Walloons in Belgium, okay, are also watching, hey, maybe we should have our own country. So there's a second, third order effect perhaps to the outcome of this. And for us Americans and any Canadians in the group, it wasn't that long ago we were looking at Quebec and Quebecois and Quebec nationalism with René Lévesque and that crowd some years ago that took place as well. The Scottish diaspora, I mean, it's kind of like the Irish. There seem to be Scotsmen of some sort everywhere, okay? We don't have St. Paddy's Day, but there is St. Andrew's Day, but not nearly as celebrated as St. Paddy's. But Bannockburn 700, which is today. Okay, technically it's tomorrow in Scotland, but close enough, okay? But the actual major celebration is this weekend, which ironically coincides with Armed Forces Day in the UK. Okay, which they will be commemorating at the same time, which is kind of interesting. But the Ryder Cup, for you golf fans out there, the Commonwealth Games are going to be held in Glasgow. And the referendum, of course, is going to end up in September. So here's where we get to the big push, the so what 700 years later. What are Scotsmen, what are Englishmen talking about? What's this independence movement all about? Well, I recommend, there's lots of good websites you can go to. This is kind of fun for me. I went to the old newspaper I used to read when I lived in Scotland, the Brecon Advertiser, okay, which is online, but it has a link to the Scotsman, which is out of Edinburgh. So a lot of the information I've got comes from that. So if you want to follow along, they update this thing like every 9 minutes. There's a new article on independence coming out. So I couldn't keep up with it, so I just stopped, okay. But this poll back in May basically said of those that decided, 58% were no. This is in May. In June 12th to be exact, that number had increased to 55% or 45% yes. What you don't see in these numbers, though, are the undecided. This is a significant number and can make or break the independence movement. So it's kind of worth watching, okay? It's like a 0-0 in the World Cup, okay? You're going to see who's winning. Somebody's got to win this thing at some point, okay? I've also had the opportunity on Sunday, and Bill lives in Dundee. So I said, well, why not use Bill and Ted to convey what's going on? This is Ted's analysis, which I think, based on what Bill told me, is pretty accurate. Okay, it kind of almost looks American, and you remember our elections, right? Okay, so just read into that all you would, sort of routine, and yet to be answered question if yes wins, which I think is still true. Again, it's a very emotional issue. We don't care, we just want to win. Okay, it's one of the attitudes that comes along, and we'll talk about some of these issues as we go along. Well, we've heard from Ted. This is what Bill has to say. And I have to warn you, Bill is a diehard union. And again, he gives the S&P counter-argument that we'll go into here very shortly. And of course, I think he feels somewhat persecuted for being articulate in his, or voicing his no perspective. Well, better together is the argument that the Conservatives, the Lib Dems, and the Tory, or the Labour Party, have basically all agreed on. Most of the English politicians say, I think we're better together, okay, for lots of reasons. You don't have to agree with them. Of course, the SNP, the Scottish National Party, says, I don't think so, okay. Our reason for existence is Scottish independence, hence the Scottish Nationalist Party. So now it's the time for all good Scotsmen to come together and make this decision. And they've even lowered the voting age to 16. Okay. However, I'm not sure that's going to help because the last poll I show is the younger voters tended to be more pro-union than pro-nationalist. Okay, and if you go to the website, you can do every demographic your little heart can think of to figure out who's supporting what. Okay, so these are the issues. I'm just going to do touch and go to allow some time for questions here. Defense. Is Scotland going to form its own army? Well, S&P says yes. We're going to have a Scottish Defence Force of anywhere from 12 to 15,000. We're going to have an itty-bitty Air Force with one squadron of something, and an itty-bitty Navy, but that's all we need. And no nukes. The S&P is adamant it's a nuke-free zone. It's very New Zealand-like in that sense, which creates a conundrum for the Royal Navy. The only place they can post their nuclear submarines, their tridents, is in Scotland. So without Scotland, where do you park these hunters? Okay, now when I worked at Edsel, the locals always thought we were a secret underground submarine place, but trust me, we weren't. So I don't know where they're going to put these things. So what does this do to deterrence for Great Britain? Okay, the other thing I learned, we have a group of officers in from the UK in an exercise called Eagle Owl, and I practiced this on them last week, and the Scots came up and talked to me and said, oh, did you realize that Glasgow is the headquarters of our personnel people? What are we going to do, with that? Okay, so there's a lot of questions, particularly with foreign affairs and defense. Currency. Do we keep the English or the Bank of England as our basis of our economy, our currency? Do we form our own currency? What would that be, and how would we stabilize that? How would we support that? Or do we use the euro like other Europeans have done? All those arguments are on the table, and all of them have pluses and minuses. Even to the point that perhaps maybe we should not even have a currency, just use the English pound like nothing ever happened. Okay, there's some risk involved with that from a national perspective, and Mr. Salmon here has basically been saying that that's the English tactic of scaring us Scots into not voting for independence. It will work through it somehow. Okay, so that's a big issue. European Union. And again, all these are very much related, so it's hard to pick one and not connect it to the other ones. Will Scotland, if it votes for independence, automatically be part of the EU? Any thoughts? Yes, no, I get all, and yes or no is the usual answer, but no, if you look at some of the more experienced politicians in England, John Major, for example, and Douglas Hurd, has said, no, Scotland, you have to start all over again. You have to apply for membership as if you were a brand new country, because you are a brand new country, if you opt out of the UK. Okay, so that's a problem. Well, what does that mean if Scotland opts out of the UK about the UK status or Great Britain status in the UN? Will it lose its position as a permanent member of the UN Security Council? Again, this is one of these tangential issues that come up over time. Will you have to adopt all of the EU requirements to include immigration, to include the euro? The English have exceptions, or the UK has exemptions from that. Okay, that's why they still use the pound today. Perhaps one of the biggies, one of the things that most pro-independent Scotsmen and women hold on to, that oil out yonder is ours. London, Westminster has been using it wastefully. We should control our own assets. Okay, so if you ask an Oklahoman or a Texan or anybody with oil, who does it belong to, you get some interesting answers. From the Scots' perspective, we're not reaping the benefits of our own resources. With independence, we will. And they kind of use Norway as a model to justify this, because Norway has done quite well, and Norway is just literally across the pond, or the North Sea, from Scotland, and they've invested in kind of a nest egg for future years, and they've got almost $500 billion or $500 billion worth of assets just from North Sea oil. Okay, so we'll see what happens with this issue as well. Higher education, which never dawned on me as a big issue, but ironically, the Scots actually charge, or Scottish universities charge the Welsh, the Irish, and the English to go to school there. If they're part of the EU, they can't do that anymore. Because if you're part of the EU, you have to accept all other members, which they do if you're from France or Belgium, but they've always charged the English. So that would be an interesting thing. Plus, the funding for research and stuff that Westminster gives them proportionally is normally higher than what English university gets. So that's another big issue as well. Everybody, Americans' favorite topic, the national debt. 8.1 or 4% is what, here's how much you owe based on the £1 trillion deficit that they have, okay? And it comes out, I forget the exact number, but it's several £100 million, £1 billion rather, of stuff. So the plan is to write an IOU, okay? And when we get money, we'll pay you back. Or, I'm sorry, we're independent, all debts are off, which creates a lot of fiscal uncertainty, which doesn't bode well for either the UK or for Scotland, or for England or Scotland. Pensions. And if I look around the room, this may be of some interest. I'm aspiring to be a pensioner one day. Significant issue. Who's going to pay me? Who's going to send me my weekly 115 pounds, about 150 bucks, to keep me eating and living and that sort of stuff? Okay, it's not exactly like Social Security, but there's some comparisons there. A very serious issue because how do you fund this? How do you pay for it? How do you administer it? So lots of issues with pensions as well in there. But the last thing is something called Devo Max, what some had called Independence Light. Well, Scotland, have we got a deal for you? If you vote no, we're going to give you even more power back in Edinburgh, back in Holyrood. Okay, everything virtually except for foreign affairs and national defense. My guess is this will gain some traction, but we'll see what happens because we have to wait for the election later on. Her Majesty, of course, how many watched her speech on C-SPAN? I know C-SPAN is, well, yes, you've heard of it, okay. I actually watched this largely because I wanted to be prepared for this. And Her Majesty, of course, is not trying to take sides, but I think in her heart, regardless, the Scots want to keep her as the monarch, but she has a nice castle up in Balmoral and that sort of stuff. But I think she'd rather better together is kind of the official policy of the coalition government of the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. But the SNP is making some big promises. But basically, for those who can't see, we kind of make up our minds, Minister. God promises heaven on earth, but so does Alex Salmon, the leader of the SNP. Okay, so it's not an easy thing to do because there's an emotional aspect as well as a realistic one. But basically, this is the bottom line. The evolution from those supporting Scottish independence is a gift from London. Independence is power and right. I think we can relate to that. On the other hand, the vote no folks say, well, that's nice to say, but what are the realities of an independent Scotland? Can you really go it alone and look at all the benefits you're getting now? Okay, and of course you have to ask the key insiders on what's going on. Frodo, also known as Elijah Wood, is backing independence. Okay, and not to be outdone, Harry Potter is supporting a stronger union. Okay, or to stay within the union. And of course, movie stars, politicians, the average Scotsman are all divided on what will happen. I think this is going to what the ballot will actually look like. Gee, I wonder which one they're going to pick when you do that. But when all else fails, I think it's always wise to ask the Chinese. Okay. And when Prime Minister Cameron and the Chinese Foreign Minister got together, the Chinese Foreign Minister says, I think you guys should stay within the UK. So there you have it, okay, on that. So the bottom line is lots of issues, lots of emotion involved with this. The referendum will take place on the 18th of September, which is also another very important day in local history here. It's also the day that Auburn and K-State play. And unfortunately, I have to go to the dentist that day, but that's tertiary to these other ones. So, it's going to be a tough one to see which one to watch as time goes by. But on a serious note, Scotland, of course, has been part of the UK officially since 1707, and the Scotsmen, as a military personnel, have served in numerous wars, to include World War I. I think Henry mentioned that earlier. We're on the cusp of the press for the 100th commemoration of World War I, and the Scots have certainly done their part. If you go to any English or Scottish village, you will see a monument to the dozens, if not hundreds, of folks in every village that sacrificed for their country and the United Kingdom in World War I. And basically, that's all I have for this evening. So, Henry, if we've got time for a question or two. A little bit longer than that. Oh, sir.
Well, that was really great, Randy. We'll maybe like 4 or 5 questions, but Randy, repeat the question so everybody can hear it. Thanks.
Why did the other middle-aged or late middle-aged powers have trouble duplicating the effectiveness of the English archers? I mean, they felt the effectiveness, but it doesn't seem to me like the bow is a very high technological product to produce. So,
right, I don't have a great answer for you, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. I mean, logically, you're correct. And basically what was being asked is why didn't other European powers specifically develop archery, or the longbow particularly, as effectively as the English did? Terry, do you have anything? Or?
Yeah, it took too long to master it.
Okay.
You can just pick up a longbowmen trained for 10 to 15 years before they were in the
And that's Dr. Beckenbaugh, and he's the guy I was referencing earlier that actually took English history, so thanks, Terry. So, sir.
Just to expand on your European Union thought,
Yes.
the Conservatives have pledged they will allow a vote to leave the European Union, and they're very determined to do so. So that also colors the argument on what's going to happen if Scotland does.
Okay. Yeah, excellent point. And basically, just to hit the highlights here, there's a big movement in England, and there's a whole party, the UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party, that is making a very strong argument, and it's getting some traction, I think, that it's better for the UK to opt out of the EU altogether, which creates some interesting dilemmas because you might find Scotland in the EU and England out of it, which creates all sorts of other concerns. You can even take that a step further. If you're familiar with the West Islands and the Orkneys and the Shetlands, there's a movement there to opt out of Scotland if they opt out of the UK to be part of Norway, of all places. And there is a kind of a Viking Celtic connection up there. For those of you watching the Vikings on the History Channel, like my wife does, she loves that show. So, sir.
Just very quickly, why did Robert Bruce do a turnaround and go with these commoners as opposed to just doing what he did at, what was it, Stirling Bridge? Stirling?
Well, actually, Robert the Bruce wasn't at Stirling. William Wallace and Andy Murray were there.
There was another, I think it was a subsequent battle then, Falkirk.
Well, he wasn't at Falkirk either.
That's inaccurate.
Well, now there's a place called Methven, which is after he crowns him, or gets crowned basically, and he gets swacked there. It's a smaller battle that he does there, but he never really is part of a successful conventional battle that I'm aware of. Terry, do you know of any?
Well, it's in the movie Braveheart.
Yeah, Robert the Bruce.
other than
Bannockburn, okay. Yeah, now he is very adept at guerrilla tactics, and he does endear himself to his men. To the average, the commoner, the Scotsman at that point, and is able, through his other leaders, the Earl Moray, Randolph, as well as the other guy, Douglas, James Douglas. So he's got some good subordinate commanders that are loyal to him that do that. There's also, and again, I'm not sure the validity of this, the Scots, like most armies, had camp followers. And one of the stories, and I think there's some validity to this, but as the English were leaving the field, they're up on a place called Gillies Hill, and actually will en masse begin moving, and the English said, oh no, there's another Skiltron, or another reserve coming, we better get the heck out of Dodge. In reality, they're basically there to scavenge, to collect what they could off the battlefield. So, but yeah, I mean, Bruce is an interesting character because he does well at Bannockburn, but I don't think there's anything specific to his past that basically allows him to be successful there, if that makes sense. I know in the movies he's everywhere, but in reality, yeah. And again, there's nothing wrong with the film. I mean, it's a great film, but that's one of the challenges. Sir?
I was just curious, do the Scottish nationalists look at the success of the Republic of Ireland and say, look, they did it, we can do it too?
There is a definitive Irish look by the Scottish, and the question is to what degree does the Irish Republic serve as a model, paraphrasing here, for the Scottish nationalists? And I think in a very real sense it does, without the fighting and the Easter Rising and all that bloodshed. We've done all that, sort of routine. So in one sense it's a very civil way to resolve conflict, but it does get very emotional. I can imagine, particularly in Glasgow, with enough whiskey and whatnot, that there are some pretty intense, heated arguments that go on there. So over here, then back here, sir.
You know, so often the mud, so to speak, of Mars, at Agincourt, here, Waterloo, you're kind of associated with the military academy level.
Yes, the Staff College, yes.
Don't they teach a course on having someone go out there and see how?
Well, unfortunately, Edward did not go to the Staff College, okay? His dad tried the best he could to try to educate him in military ways, but he's kind of like Frederick the Great, only not as great. His dad kind of forces him, well, you got to do this or you're going to get punished, sort of routine, but he never quite got the grasp of doing what we call intelligence preparation at the battlefield, understanding your terrain, what you can and cannot do. But I think there's a sense of hubris with the English. Hey, we almost always win. It may sound vaguely familiar. And the fact that he doesn't want the Scots, he's paranoid that the Scots are going to get away. That this is my big chance, not only to subjugate the Scots, but to resolve a lot of my internal issues back in England. The old trick of looking externally to solve internal problems, to take the people's mind off of what ails them, so to speak. I'll deal with that later. But yes, that is a good observation. And actually,
Consistently, they ran those heavy cavalry right into the mud.
Yep. And the Earl of Gloucester, just to add a bit of clarification, actually tried to convince Edward, hey, boss, let's wait an extra day. But remember, the 24th was the handover day of the castle, and Edward said, they might, if I give them another day, they really will run away. So there's some interesting dynamics that go on. So there are experienced fighters that are agreeing with you 100%, but the king, well, it's good to be king, right? Except when you lose, I suppose. Sir?
Is the United Kingdom prepared to accept the results of the referendum?
That's also a good question. The question is the UK willing to accept the results? Now, I've seen, because the only question on the ballot, should Scotland be independent, which is straight and simple. The SNP wanted to add a second question, if not, would you agree to Devo Max? But that's not on the ballot. It's going to be interesting because there are those in the UK that's saying, hey, this is not just a Scottish issue. This is a British issue because of national defense, because of foreign policy, because of current, all those issues affect us as much as they do the Scots. Okay, so why aren't we voting? Okay, is part of the issue. And the other thing is that Parliament has to approve the results. So some are saying that if the Conservatives, and there's a general election in the UK in next May, or it has to occur by next May, if the Tories win, there's a good chance that they could say, I don't think they would do this, but they could say, the laugh's on you, just a joke, we got that out of your system, now let's move on. I don't see that happening because I think there is a sincere commitment by the leadership, David Cameron, I think even the Queen would be upset if they didn't honor the results of the election. But my gut reaction at this point is I think the no's will win and Devo Max in some form will occur, but I don't have a crystal ball any more than anyone else. So I have time for one more question, ma'am, or sir, or ma'am, sir. Yes.
With the cavalry?
Yes.
Could you go over some details?
Yeah, just briefly from what I recall, he initially was deployed to kind of keep the English in the castle, in Stirling Castle, which was a good thing because his Robert's flank or rear is kind of exposed if Philip Mowbray comes out of the castle to attack. The second and most important part was he maneuvers his light cavalry when the English archers and Welsh archers do begin to fire. He outflanks them and hits their side, and without protection, the archers against cav are no match. So it's like cavalry trumps archers, archers trump skill trim trumps cavalry. It's kind of a rock, paper, scissors thing that comes out into it. And again, as long as if the archers had been there in numbers and properly deployed, we might have had a different outcome. But you got to give Robert the Bruce some credit because using a defensive concept offensively was something that kind of caught the English off guard. And of course, the English decisions, as this gentleman pointed out, are poor decisions to constrain a large mass of humanity and horses in a confined area without proper tactics help lead to their demise as well. So on that happy note, I think Henry said we're basically up to done, but you've been a great audience. Many thanks. So drive safely, and if you can find some good haggis tonight, enjoy. So.